Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. I'm really glad you could join us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. We have a lot of ground to cover.
We really do.
Yeah.
So for this deep dive, we're going to look past the surface of our daily lives and examine a pretty massive stack of source material. We are drawing heavily on the foundational arguments laid out in Vaclav Smil's pretty exhaustive analysis, how the world really works.
Right. And I want to set the baseline right out of the gate here. This is not a book review.
Exactly.
We aren't here to just give you a summary of chapters or, do some literary critique. The text is simply our entry point. The true identity of this deep dive, the reason we're doing this today, is systems.
Yeah, we want to look at the actual plumbing of the modern world.
Exactly. We need to bypass the moralizing, all the wishful thinking, and the surface-level political debates that just constantly dominate the news cycle.
Which is hard to do, honestly.
Yes. Oh, it's incredibly hard. But instead of taking sides, we are going to impartially map the material and energetic foundation of modern civilization. We're looking at the industrial metabolism that makes your contemporary life possible, step by step, ton by ton.
Okay, let's unpack this, because there's a core illusion that almost all of us operate under right now. If you look around your life today, maybe you're listening to this on a sleek smartphone.
Right?
Or maybe you work on a lightweight laptop, or you order your groceries with a quick thumb tap on an app.
Yeah, it feels completely weightless.
It does. It deeply feels like we live in a dematerialized world. The prevailing narrative is that we've transitioned into this digital, service-based economy that just exists somewhere up in the ether of the cloud.
Which is a brilliant piece of marketing, but thermodynamically false.
Exactly. We send emails, we stream massive amounts of data, we tap a screen, and a car magically appears at the curb. It feels completely detached from heavy industry, like we've evolved past the age of smokestacks and grinding gears.
And it's a remarkably convincing illusion, primarily because the heavy lifting is kept completely out of sight. But here's the reality check for you.
Lay it on us.
We have never, in the entire history of our species, been more materially dependent on massive physical processes than we are right this exact second.
Wow.
The digital world you interact with is just the absolute tip of a very heavy, very physical iceberg. So the primary system we need to identify today is a massive, globally distributed industrial energy machine. And its entire structural purpose is to convert fossil carbon, mineral extraction, and synthetic chemistry into the food, the infrastructure, the mobility, and the everyday abundance that you and I take completely for granted.
And when you look at the raw data, the sheer scale of the system supporting you is almost difficult to comprehend.
Yeah.
I mean, we share this planet with roughly 8 billion people.
Right.
But only about a fifth of those people, a clear minority of the global population, enjoy this unprecedented standard of living.
Where you live decades longer than your ancestors, in far better health, surrounded by just incredible material comforts.
Yeah, and every single bit of that abundance is built on this hidden grinding system.
And that system rests on a foundation that most of us never even factor into our daily equations. Modern civilization rests materially on 4 structural pillars.
4 pillars.
Yes. And it's crucial to understand that these aren't consumer luxuries. You don't go to the store and buy these for fun. They are the structural inputs of the world.
They're the prerequisites for everything else.
Exactly. Those 4 pillars are ammonia, plastics, steel, and cement.
Okay, I have to pause on that first one. Because when I first dug into the data, ammonia really caught me off guard.
It surprises a lot of people.
Right. I mean, I get steel, obviously. I get cement. We see those everywhere. But ammonia.
But the numbers are absolutely emphatic about this. It is the unsung structural hero, or perhaps villain, depending on your geopolitical perspective of the modern world.
Without question.
Yeah.
It ranks first in terms of absolute existential necessity.
Oh, right. It does. Without it, you wouldn't just have fewer buildings or have to drive smaller cars. You would have a fundamentally different, drastically smaller global population.
How much smaller?
To put it directly and analytically, without the Haber-Bosch synthesis of ammonia, which is the foundational process for creating synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, half the world's population simply would not exist today.
Half?
Nearly 4 billion people.
That is just staggering. 4 billion lives hanging entirely on a specific chemical synthesis.
They would not be alive. It's that simple.
That is heavy. But let's clarify the chemistry here, because it's vital context for you listening. Nitrogen is everywhere, right? It's in the atmosphere right now.
It makes up nearly 80% of the air we're currently breathing.
So if it's everywhere, why is it a bottleneck for human survival?
What's fascinating here is the physical nature of that nitrogen molecule. Atmospheric nitrogen consists of two nitrogen atoms bound together by a triple covalent bond.
And a triple bond is tough to break.
It is incredibly strong. It's virtually inert. Now, plants are desperate for nitrogen to grow. It's essential for chlorophyll and amino acids, but they are completely incapable of breaking that triple bond to access the nitrogen in the air.
So they're starving in a sea of plenty.
Exactly. Naturally, only a few extreme forces can break it to make it reactive and useful. Lightning does it, creating nitrogen oxides that fall in the rain.
Right.
And certain bacteria residing on the roots of leguminous plants like peas and beans possess enzymes that can fix nitrogen. But that natural biological input is a hard mathematical limit.
It's nowhere near enough to feed 8 billion people.
Not even close. Before the 20th century, we were literally scraping the bottom of the barrel for nitrogen. Nations fought wars over guano islands, literally bird droppings off the coast of Peru, just to get agricultural fertilizer.
We were facing a very real demographic cliff.
We were. The human population was colliding with the natural thermodynamic limits of the nitrogen cycle. And this is where human ingenuity intervened and fundamentally altered the Earth's carrying capacity.
Enter the Haber-Bosch process.
Exactly. Developed in the early 20th century, it essentially takes what lightning does with tremendous natural temperature and pressure and replicates it inside a massive industrial factory.
So we mix nitrogen from the air with hydrogen.
Yes, and subject it to immense pressure and heat over a catalyst, forcing those triple bonds to break and synthesizing ammonia.
But here is the massive catch. And this is where we really start to see the industrial energy machine locking in. To synthesize this ammonia, to generate that kind of extreme heat and pressure, you need an incredible amount of energy.
A massive amount.
And you also need a source for the hydrogen atoms. Where does almost all of that come from?
Natural gas.
Right.
Natural gas is the ultimate dual-purpose input here. It is the chemical feedstock, the methane provides the hydrogen, and it is also the fuel combusted to provide the intense thermal energy required for the synthesis.
So we're burning it, and we're using it as an ingredient.
Precisely. And the physics set a hard floor for this process. The absolute theoretical minimum energy required to synthesize a ton of ammonia is roughly 21 gigajoules.
Let's translate that for a second. Gigajoules can sound like a sci-fi term. What does 21 gigajoules actually look like in the real world?
To put that in perspective for you, a single gigajoule is roughly equivalent to the energy contained in 8 gallons of gasoline.
Right.
So 21 gigajoules is the energy equivalent of nearly 170 gallons of gasoline. You physically cannot break that nitrogen bond and create a ton of ammonia without expending at least that massive amount of energy.
It is a thermodynamic law, not a policy choice.
Exactly. And we synthesize over 150 million tons of ammonia every single year.
Which brings up a really profound realization. The systems ecologist Howard Odum pointed this out decades ago, and it completely shifts how you view a grocery store.
Yeah, his framing of this is brilliant.
He noted that industrial man no longer eats potatoes made from solar energy. He eats potatoes partly made of oil. Our food is literally transformed fossil fuels.
You are essentially eating natural gas when you eat a loaf of bread.
Because the wheat in that bread was grown in soil saturated with synthetic nitrogen fertilizer derived from methane.
And if we look comprehensively at the agricultural system, it's not just natural gas. You are also eating coal.
Coal.
Yes, coal, which was mined and purified into coke to smelt the steel that built the heavy combine harvester that collected the wheat.
Right.
You're eating the diesel fuel that powered that harvester's massive internal combustion engine. When you aggregate the global data, at least half of all global crop harvests today rely entirely on synthetic nitrogen.
And in heavily populated areas like China, it's closer to 60%.
Exactly.
Now, let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because the immediate reaction from a lot of people is, well, synthetic fertilizers are bad for the soil anyway. We should just transition back to organic farming, use manure, use compost, problem solved.
It's a completely understandable sentiment, but it fails a basic quantitative reality check. Smil runs the strict mathematical calculations on this in the source material.
And what does the math say?
If we attempted to replace the current volume of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer with organic manure, we hit a brick wall regarding nutrient density. The nitrogen density in animal manure is incredibly low compared to the concentration in synthetic urea.
So you need a lot more of it.
You would need to apply roughly 10 to 40 times as much manure by mass just to deliver the same amount of reactive nitrogen to the crops.
And we simply do not have that much manure.
We don't. There simply isn't enough recyclable organic matter on the entire planet to provide the nitrogen required by today's harvest volumes.
Plus, to generate that much manure, you'd need, what, an astronomically larger global cattle herd?
Yes, which would require vast amounts of land for grazing and feed land we currently use to grow crops for human consumption. It is a mathematical and spatial impossibility to feed 8 billion people organically without drastically and tragically reducing the human population.
Okay, so we've established that ammonia literally grows our food. We are tethered to it.
Deeply tethered.
But getting that food from the soil to your plate, especially in the middle of winter, requires another material entirely. One that protects the crops, packages the harvest, handles the logistics. That brings us to the second structural pillar.
Plastics.
Plastics, which get a really bad rap.
They do, and plastics are often deeply misunderstood in popular discourse. We tend to focus entirely on consumer waste. The single-use grocery bags, the cheap toys, the takeout containers.
Right, the stuff floating in the ocean.
But as a structural pillar of modern civilization, plastics are the ultimate lightweight enabler. Their defining qualities are that they are highly formable, incredibly lightweight, water-resistant, and chemically durable.
If we look at agriculture again, plastics are everywhere. Those fresh tomatoes you buy in January, they are grown in massive multi-tunnel greenhouses.
And what are those greenhouses made of?
Heavy, shatterproof plastics. The irrigation systems are extruded PVC piping. The crops are held up by plastic clips and wedges. Even in open fields, farmers use vast sheets of plastic mulch covering the soil to prevent weeds and drastically reduce water evaporation.
And we absolutely must extend this to healthcare. The modern hospital is entirely dependent on sterile plastics.
Oh, totally. Think of the IV tubing, the syringes, the sterile packaging for surgical instruments.
Incubators for premature infants, the internal components of life-saving monitors. Plastics allow for mass-produced sterility. But the crucial analytical point for our systems evaluation is understanding the origin of this material.
Because plastics do not grow on trees.
No, and they cannot currently be willed into existence by software.
So walk us through that origin. When we talk about synthesizing plastic at a scale of hundreds of millions of tons a year, what is the actual feedstock?
The chemical origin of the vast majority of plastics involves creating polymers from monomers like ethylene and propylene.
Stop right there. Let's define those terms for clarity. What is a monomer and what is cracking?
Good point. Think of a monomer as a single link in a chain. Ethylene and propylene are basic hydrocarbon molecules, these single links. Okay.
A polymer, which is what plastic actually is the finished, long, durable chain made by bonding thousands of those links together.
Got it.
But to get those specific links, those monomers, you have to extract them from crude oil and natural gas. You subject the raw fossil hydrocarbons to a process called steam cracking.
Steam cracking.
Yes, you use immense thermal energy to literally crack the large hydrocarbon molecules apart into the specific smaller molecules you need for plastics.
So again, just like with ammonia, fossil fuels are doing double duty.
Precisely.
The crude oil is the physical raw material that becomes the plastic, and burning fossil fuels provides the massive heat required for the cracking process.
Exactly. Lightweight manufacturing, global logistics, sterile healthcare, electrical insulation for every wire in your house, it all traces back fundamentally to fossil carbon.
Which naturally leads us to the physical skeleton of our civilization, the structures that hold everything up. The third and fourth pillars, steel and cement. The sheer scale of consumption here truly defies human intuition. If we look at the data for a single recent year, say 2019, the global economy consumed roughly 4.5 billion tons of cement.
4.5 billion.
And 1.8 billion tons of steel. Billion. With a B. Our brains are not evolved to picture that volume of material.
I tried to visualize it, and it's like enough cement to pour a massive multi-lane concrete highway from the Earth to the moon.
Every single year.
And enough steel to build thousands of Golden Gate bridges every single year. And just like the first two pillars, we have to look at how these are actually made. Because I think a lot of people assume, well, we are electrifying the grid, we have wind turbines and solar panels, we'll just use clean electricity to make our steel and cement.
It's a very common assumption.
Why doesn't that work?
It fails because of the specific chemical and thermal requirements of the manufacturing processes. Let's take steel. The majority of the world's primary steel is not made from recycled scrap in electric arc furnaces.
Right, electric arc is for recycling.
Exactly. Primary steel is made from raw iron ore in massive blast furnaces. To smelt iron ore, to strip away the oxygen atoms and leave pure iron, you need a reducing agent. You need carbon.
And this is where coke comes in. We hear that term a lot in heavy industry. How is coke different from just a lump of coal you dig out of the ground?
Excellent question. Coke is essentially purified coal. You take metallurgical coal and bake it in massive ovens without oxygen. This drives off the impurities like water and coal gas.
How much left?
What you're left with is a highly concentrated, porous chunk of nearly pure carbon. You dump this coke into the blast furnace along with the iron ore. The coke burns, providing extreme heat, but more importantly, it reacts chemically.
Okay, so it's a chemical necessity, not just a heat source.
Precisely. The carbon from the coke bonds with the oxygen in the iron ore, creating carbon dioxide, which goes up the smokestack, leaving behind the molten iron.
So you cannot currently achieve this massive continuous chemical reduction process using a solar panel. You need the physical carbon atom.
You absolutely do.
And cement is a similar story regarding extreme heat, isn't it?
It is. Cement is the crucial binding ingredient in concrete. To make Portland cement, you have to take limestone and clay, grind it up, and pass it through a massive rotating rotary kiln.
I've seen videos of these. They're huge.
These kilns are some of the largest moving pieces of industrial machinery on Earth. Inside that kiln, the material must be heated to about 1,450 degrees Celsius to trigger a chemical reaction called calcination.
Which transforms the raw materials into clinker.
Exactly.
1,450 degrees Celsius. That is nearly 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit.
It is effectively a man-made volcano. Generating that level of sustained, continuous, radiant heat inside a massive cylinder requires fuel with incredibly high energy density.
And where does that come from globally?
Globally, that energy comes predominantly from combusting pulverized coal dust, petroleum coke, and heavy fuel oil.
So you can't just plug a commercial-scale cement kiln into a local wind farm.
No. The electrical heating technology at that scale simply does not exist yet commercially. Furthermore, the calcination process itself, the chemical breakdown of the limestone, releases massive amounts of CO2, entirely independent of the fuel burned to heat it.
Wow. So when we aggregate these four pillars, ammonia, plastics, steel, and cement, what is the overall impact on our global energy and emissions budget?
Together, the global production of just these four materials claims about 17% of the world's primary energy supply.
17%.
And they account for a full 25% of all CO2 emissions originating from fossil fuel combustion.
1/4 of our global emissions comes from making the basic building blocks of survival.
Correct.
Okay, here's the pivotal question. If 25% of our fossil fuel emissions come from making these materials, and we know the climate risks, why can't we just mandate a massive reduction?
Why not just stop building so much, right?
Yeah, or severely cut back.
If we look at the system impartially, this brings us directly into the incentive architecture of the modern world. Why is this system so deeply locked in?
Incentives are everything.
They really are. It is locked in because the prime movers of human society are survival and prosperity. States are fundamentally incentivized to maintain food security, drive economic growth, and ensure geopolitical stability.
Meaning, if you're a head of state, your primary job is making sure your people aren't starving and aren't freezing.
Exactly. You simply cannot tell half of your population that they have to accept famine because the synthetic fertilizer required to grow their grain is too carbon intensive.
Right.
You cannot tell a developing nation they aren't allowed to pour concrete for hospitals, paved roads, and sanitation systems because we need to hit an emissions target.
And this highlights one of the most sobering statistics we found in the data.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about how only 1/5 of the world enjoys true abundance. Well, the data shows that roughly 40% of the global population right now, that is over 3.1 billion people, currently survives on an average energy supply that is no higher than what Germany and France had in the year 1860.
Let's contextualize that. The year 1860.
Now think about that.
This is before the widespread electrification of cities. This is an era where human muscle, animal labor, and the burning of wood and early dirty coal were the primary drivers of life.
And for 3.1 billion people today, that is effectively their energetic reality.
Their access to the benefits of high-density energy is severely constrained.
So if you are a policymaker in a developing nation in sub-Saharan Africa or parts of Southeast Asia, your absolute non-negotiable mandate is to pull your people out of that energetic poverty.
And that mandate has massive structural implications. To reach even a basic, dignified standard of living, one with reliable electricity, sturdy housing, modern sanitation, and mechanized transport, those 3.1 billion people must at least double, and preferably triple, their per capita energy use over the coming decades.
Which means a colossal incoming surge in demand for all four pillars.
Correct. If Africa is going to feed its rapidly growing population, they require a staggering influx of synthetic fertilizer. Currently, the continent uses a tiny fraction of the fertilizer applied per hectare compared to European or Chinese averages.
And they need to build infrastructure.
Right. If they're going to replace dirt floors with concrete floors, which, by the way, public health data shows reduces parasitic diseases and infant mortality by massive margins, they need millions of tons of cement. They need structural steel to build the electrical grids and the bridges.
This is where the global energy divide becomes a stark structural reality that we have to face without romanticizing it. The affluent world, the people listening to this deep dive in air-conditioned homes or cars, can talk comfortably about cutting back on consumption.
Because they already have the infrastructure.
Exactly. But the vast majority of the planet is currently incentivized, heavily and justifiably, to consume significantly more physical materials to achieve basic human dignity.
And it's not just the developing world driving this inertia. We have to ruthlessly examine corporate and consumer incentives in the affluent world as well.
Oh, absolutely. Let's turn the lens on ourselves for a moment. As consumers, our primary incentives are affordability and convenience. We want to walk into a brilliantly lit supermarket in the middle of a freezing winter, bypass the root vegetables, and buy a perfectly round, bright red, fresh tomato.
And we want it to cost $3.
We don't want to think about how it got there.
But the reality of how it got there perfectly illustrates the hidden cost of our convenience. Smil details what can be called the tomato paradox, which is a brilliant systems-level example of our material dependency.
Break down the tomato paradox for us.
Think about the physical composition of a tomato. Botanically, it is mostly just water. Over 95% of its mass is pure water.
Okay.
Nutritionally, it offers some vitamin C and lycopene, but it is not a dense energy source. You cannot fuel a labor force on tomatoes the way you can on wheat or rice. Yet, to get that delicate sphere of water to your table in a temperate climate during the winter requires an astonishing deployment of industrial effort.
Right. You can't just plant a seed in the frozen ground. First, you have to grow it commercially, which means constructing massive multi-tunnel greenhouses.
That requires tons of structural plastics and steel framing.
Then you have to keep the temperature inside that greenhouse at a balmy 25 degrees Celsius while it's snowing outside. How do you do that? You pipe in continuous heat by combusting natural gas.
And the inputs don't stop there. You have to protect the plants using complex pesticides and fungicides, which are synthesized using hydrocarbon feedstocks. You fertilize them with ammonia derived from natural gas.
And then comes the transportation.
Once harvested, you place them in plastic clamshell packaging, load them into a refrigerated trailer made of steel, aluminum, and polyurethane foam insulation, and transport them thousands of miles.
Using a heavy diesel engine.
Exactly. You are deploying massive amounts of fossil-fueled heat, synthetic chemicals, and heavy logistics just to transport a delicate container of water across a continent, simply because consumers want the convenience of out-of-season produce.
And corporations are deeply incentivized to scale this production and maintain these hyper-complex supply chains because it is highly profitable.
And the political system sits on top of all of this, rewarding the status quo.
Yeah.
A politician's primary job security relies on keeping food cheap, keeping homes warm, and keeping the gross domestic product growing.
The political incentive is always skewed overwhelmingly toward maintaining the current functioning system, over taking on the massive, genuinely disruptive risk of a rapid, long-term energy transition.
Which leads us perfectly to the predictable structural outcomes of the system. Because the system is so successful at providing convenience, it has created a profound psychological side effect. We now live in a black box society.
I love this concept. Explain the black box society.
Urbanization and mechanization have completely disconnected the average person from material reality. For most of human history, people saw the labor required to survive. You chopped the wood, you saw the crop fail, you hauled the water.
It was visceral.
Very visceral. Today, we interact with black boxes. You tap a piece of glass on your smartphone, and a cardboard box arrives at your door the next day. You turn a dial on your wall, and your house instantly gets warm.
The incredibly complex, dirty, heavy industrial processes inside those boxes are totally invisible to you.
And the employment data really hammers this home. Look at the shift in labor. Today, less than 1% of the American population is directly engaged in agriculture.
Wow.
Think about the magnitude of that. Less than 1% of the country is actually out there plowing fields, applying the synthetic fertilizer, managing the irrigation, and harvesting the crops that keep the other 99% alive.
And the numbers are equally staggering when you look at heavy manufacturing. I mean, China is the dominant global producer of steel, producing over 1 billion tons annually. But all of that heavy lifting, the mining of the ore, the operation of the blast furnaces, the casting, the continuous rolling, is executed by less than 1/4% of China's 1.4 billion people.
So the vast majority of modern citizens, the urban service workers, the lawyers, the software developers, the financial analysts, you and I as podcast hosts will never stand near a blast furnace.
No.
We will never visit a steam cracking facility. We will never see the massive scale of material throughput that keeps us alive.
And because this physical world is entirely hidden from them, we start to see the rise of what the analysis terms data worshippers.
Yes. Data worshippers are individuals who work entirely within the disembodied realm of information streams of electrons, software code, algorithms, financial models.
And because they manipulate the digital world with such ease, they begin to project that fluidity onto the physical world. They start to believe that software can somehow bypass our physical constraints.
This is exactly where we get into the tech utopian ideas that dominate Silicon Valley press releases. And again, we aren't taking political sides or mocking innovation here. We are just applying strict engineering realities and thermodynamic math.
Right. Impartial systems analysis.
Exactly. We constantly see these gorgeous, sleek 3D renderings of urban high-rise agriculture, skyscrapers in the middle of Manhattan bathed in purple LED lights, promising to grow all our food vertically and save the planet.
It is a highly compelling image, but it fails completely when you analyze it on the level of scale and thermodynamics.
Completely. Yes, hydroponics and aeroponics can efficiently grow leafy greens, lettuce, basil, arugula, things that are essentially 90% water and roughage.
Right.
But you cannot use an urban high-rise to produce the 3 billion tons of staple grains and legumes like wheat, rice, corn, and soybeans that are needed to actually sustain the caloric requirements of human life.
Why not? If we had the LEDs, why can't we just stack the wheat?
Because wheat and rice are incredibly dense carbohydrates. They require massive amounts of continuous solar radiation to grow. If you move that process indoors, you have to replace the free, abundant energy of the sun with artificial electricity.
And that energy has to come from somewhere.
The energy cost to artificially light, heat, and manage the humidity of a skyscraper just to grow heavy carbohydrate crops would be astronomically high. You'd be burning massive amounts of coal or natural gas at the power plant just to power the LEDs to grow a loaf of bread. It is thermodynamically absurd.
And here is where it gets genuinely wild. The analysis points out that this disconnect has bred actual mainstream fantasies. For example, the idea that we don't need to worry about Earth's ecological constraints because we are just going to terraform Mars.
Oh, yes.
We have highly influential people who seriously believe we are going to relocate human civilization to a barren, freezing, irradiated, airless rock when we haven't even figured out how to synthesize fertilizer without natural gas here on a planet that is literally perfectly suited for biological life.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the modern comprehension deficit. It's a fantasy fostered by a society where the gritty reality of material engineering has been totally obscured by digital convenience.
If a software update fails, you reboot. If a harvest fails on Mars, you die.
And this exact same systemic disconnect distorts our perception of the energy transition. We run headlong into the paradox of green technology.
Right, let's play devil's advocate again. A listener might say, but we are building green tech. We are transitioning. Look at all the wind turbines and electric vehicles, and we all want cleaner energy.
Of course you do.
But the paradox is that building the infrastructure for these alternative technologies requires massive, unprecedented inputs of the 4 structural pillars we just discussed.
Decarbonization is extraordinarily slow, not just because existing infrastructure is capital intensive, but because the new green infrastructure is incredibly material intensive.
Because renewables are diffuse.
Exactly. Renewable energy sources are inherently diffuse. The wind and the sun are spread out. To capture that diffuse energy, you have to build massive physical collectors.
Let's look at a commercial wind turbine. A wind turbine is the ultimate symbol of a green future. But what is it, structurally?
When you look at the raw materials, it's staggering. A single large wind turbine requires nearly 200 tons of steel for every megawatt of installed capacity.
200 tons of steel.
The massive blades, which can be longer than a football field, are made of about 15 tons of plastic resins and fiberglass, which, as we discussed, are derived from fossil fuels via steam cracking and are currently incredibly difficult to recycle.
And they sit on massive bases.
A massive foundational base of reinforced concrete, utilizing hundreds of tons of cement.
And you have to account for the logistics. All of those giant components have to be manufactured in factories utilizing fossil heat. They're transported to remote sites by specialized diesel-powered heavy trucks. They are hoisted into the air by massive diesel-powered cranes.
The gearboxes inside the nacelle have to be constantly lubricated with synthetic oil. The green energy output relies entirely on a foundation of fossil fuel input.
And the material requirements for electric vehicles are even more complex.
Consider the EV battery. To build a typical lithium-ion car battery weighing about 450 kilograms, you need specific, highly refined elemental metals.
Like what? What are the actual numbers?
Roughly speaking, you need about 11 kilograms of lithium, 14 kilograms of cobalt, 27 kilograms of nickel, 40 kilograms of copper, and 50 kilograms of graphite, plus another 180 kilograms of steel, aluminum, and plastics for the casing and management systems.
And again, you don't just find a pure chunk of lithium or cobalt lying on the ground waiting to be picked up.
No. These elements are present in very low concentrations in the Earth's crust. To get the specific refined materials for just one 450-kilogram battery, you must extract and process about 225 tons of raw earth.
Let's define 225 tons for a second. That is nearly 500,000 pounds of rock and dirt.
Exactly. You have to dynamite, excavate, crush, and chemically treat 225 tons of rock, utilizing massive diesel-powered mining machinery and toxic chemical leaching processes to get the materials for one single electric car battery.
Now multiply that massive earth-moving requirement by the roughly 100 million new vehicles the global auto industry produces every single year.
The scale of extraction required for the transition is simply colossal. We are talking about a massive, historic expansion of global mining, much of which will rely heavily on the very diesel engines and fossil fuel systems we are theoretically trying to replace.
And this global supply chain ties directly into another predictable structural outcome of our current system, accelerating globalization.
This is a great point because we have this modern narrative that the internet created globalization.
We think of globalization as data moving across fiber optic cables. But data doesn't move a physical shipment of cobalt, and it doesn't move a winter tomato. Physical engines do.
Right.
Globalization was built by very specific technical and heavy engineering advances that took off long before the internet existed.
The internet is simply the communication overlay. The true physical engines of global trade are large, powerful diesel engines for supertankers and cargo ships, massive gas turbines that power wide-body jetliners, the standardization of the steel shipping container, which completely revolutionized cargo handling, and eventually the microchips needed to track and coordinate all that complex logistics.
And even those microchips aren't immaterial.
Not at all. Producing electronic-grade silicon for microchips is one of the most highly energy-intensive processes on Earth. It requires orders of magnitude more primary energy per kilogram to produce pure silicon wafers than it does to smelt steel. The digital world is incredibly energy dense.
So if we pull all these threads together, we have this massive globally distributed system. It operates at a scale that is incomprehensible to the human brain. It is deeply dependent on specific physical materials that require fossil fuels to produce.
And it is heavily incentivized by the survival and comfort of 8 billion people to keep running exactly as it is.
Which brings us to the systems analysis of feedback loops. Why is this system so stubbornly persistent?
Let's explicitly map out the self-reinforcing loop at the heart of this, because this is where the system's perspective really illuminates the reality. The loop begins with energy abundance.
Okay.
Access to dense fossil energy enables massive industrial growth. That industrial growth drastically increases the demand for structural materials like steel, cement, and plastics.
Okay, so energy leads to industry, which leads to materials.
Correct. To manufacture those materials, you reinforce your need for extraction, more coal mining, more oil drilling. That fossil extraction, particularly in the form of natural gas, directly supports your agricultural yield through the synthesis of ammonia fertilizer.
Extraction leads to agriculture.
High reliable agricultural yields keep food prices stable and populations fed, which in turn stabilizes political systems.
And stable political systems are deeply risk-averse. They actively avoid disruptive structural changes that might threaten the energy industry agriculture chain that keeps them in power.
It's a perfect locked-in loop.
Energy creates industry, which demands materials, which requires extraction, which fuels agriculture, which creates political stability, which protects the energy system. And round we go.
Exactly.
But I can hear a frustrated listener asking, okay, but we have laws. Why can't a government just mandate a change? Why can't we just pass legislation that says by 2030 our national grid and heavy industry will be 100% renewable?
Because you cannot legislate away thermodynamic reality, and you cannot easily overcome the physics of inertia. First, there is the fundamental issue of infrastructure turnover. The physical world moves at a glacial pace compared to the digital world.
A software update to your phone takes 10 minutes.
But a primary steel mill, a massive cement kiln, a global container port, or a Haber-Bosch fertilizer plant, these are multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar capital investments.
You don't just scrap a functioning billion-dollar fertilizer plant that is currently feeding your population simply because a new political target was announced at a climate summit.
You don't. The economic and social cost of early retirement for massive infrastructure is staggering. And even beyond the economics, as we've discussed, there are hard physical limits.
The 21 gigajoules.
Yes, we mentioned the 21 gigajoules required to synthesize a ton of ammonia. Physics sets a hard, immutable floor that human legislation simply cannot bypass. You cannot command a nitrogen bond to break with less energy just because you passed a law.
And we can actually see the reality of this inertia in the real-world data, not just in theory. Let's look at Germany's Energiewende, their massive, highly publicized national energy transition program.
It is the perfect case study. Germany has spent vast amounts of wealth, hundreds of billions of euros over 2 decades, aggressively building out wind and solar power infrastructure. And to be fair, they have had success in generating a significant portion of their electricity from renewables.
Right. If you look at just their electrical grid on a sunny, windy day, the numbers look great. But what happened to their actual total primary energy supply? When you factor in everything, heating, transportation, heavy manufacturing.
The data is sobering. Despite all those hundreds of billions of euros and despite immense political will, Germany's overall reliance on fossil fuels for primary energy only dropped from roughly 84% to about 78% over a 20-year period.
A 6% drop over 2 decades.
Because, as the analysis notes, Germans still like driving on the Autobahn, they still fly globally, they still heat their homes in the winter.
And they're manufacturing.
They're massive, world-class manufacturing industries. The chemical plants, the auto factories, the heavy machinery builders still require immense volumes of natural gas and oil to physically make things. The foundational base of the economy is incredibly sticky.
And if we pan out from Germany and look globally, even the most carefully considered long-term energy supply scenarios acknowledge this massive inertia.
Look at the projections from the International Energy Agency, the IEA. They employ some of the best modelers in the world to map out various energy futures.
What do they project?
In their most aggressive decarbonization scenario, the scenario where nations cooperate, technology advances rapidly, and we do almost everything right to hit climate targets, they still project that fossil fuels will be supplying 56% of global primary energy by the year 2040.
56%. We will still be getting more than half of our energy from fossil fuels in the best-case scenario 2 decades from now.
That is the reality of the data. The system persists with such stubbornness because materially, it works.
It manages to feed 8 billion people.
It builds the megacities, it transports the vital goods.
Yeah.
And turning a ship of that massive size and momentum takes an incredibly long time.
Which brings us to the ultimate point of this deep dive. To truly grasp the world, we have to connect this industrial metabolism to the larger nested systems it sits within.
Our global industrial energy system doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is nested within rigid ecological limits, obviously. As we push the biosphere to its absolute boundaries through emissions and resource depletion.
It's also nested within demographic growth. We have to accommodate the populations in Africa and Asia that are expanding and rightfully demanding the same living standards we enjoy.
And perhaps most insidiously, it is nested within our cultural narratives and media ecosystems.
This is a crucial point. Our media systems and a general societal quantitative illiteracy severely distort our perception of risk. We get caught up in endless surface-level debates about intentions.
We argue fiercely on social media over whether a politician used the right buzzword, or we obsess over the launch of a new app or the latest rendering of a vertical farm.
All the while, we completely ignore the massive grinding, carbon-intensive engineering scale operating silently underneath us just to keep the lights on and the grocery shelves stocked.
So, having mapped the material reality, the incentives, the constraints, and the illusions, we must explicitly ask the central question that arises from all of this material.
Absolutely. I want to put this directly to you, the listener, as you navigate your day-to-day. What is the crisis in perception here?
Analytically, the crisis is the profound, widening disconnect between our modern lived experience and the actual material reality of our
The
existence.
black box.
Exactly. The vast majority of people, especially in the affluent developed world, experience modern life as digital, service-based, lightweight, and post-industrial. But the unyielding foundation of that life remains deeply physical, heavily carbon-intensive, and vastly chemically complex. The crisis in perception is that extreme convenience obscures the structural layer of energy and material throughput.
We only see the polished surface. Surface debates focus almost entirely on moral urgency. People demand immediate action, immediate transitions to a post-carbon world by 2030 without any concept of the underlying engineering scale required.
They ignore the physical inertia of heavy infrastructure, and they are blind to the deep existential dependency we currently have on this system simply to prevent mass starvation.
These foundational truths remain totally invisible to the average person interacting purely with their smooth black boxes.
And that is exactly why a systems-level analysis is so critical. It is the only methodology that restores proportionality to how we view the world.
It restores our awareness of hard physical constraints, and it injects a desperately needed dose of quantitative literacy into our worldview.
We have to fully understand the staggering scale of the physical materials required just to keep us alive before we can realistically, practically talk about how to engineer a change to the system.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the hidden machinery of the world, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over something we haven't touched on yet, but that builds directly on these constraints.
And what's that?
If our absolute survival is entirely dependent on continuous access to these four basic physical pillars, ammonia, plastic, steel, and cement, how does this shift our understanding of future geopolitical conflicts?
That is a critical vector to consider.
We spend so much time worrying about the next frontier of warfare. We worry about cyber warfare, autonomous drones, and AI arms races. But if you look at the thermodynamic reality we've laid out today, the true existential battles of the 21st century might not be fought in the cloud.
They might be fought over access to high-grade limestone, massive deposits of metallurgical coal, vast reserves of natural gas.
And the increasingly unglamorous heavy mineral deposits required simply to keep the concrete pouring and the synthetic fertilizer flowing.
If a nation cannot secure the inputs for the four pillars, its digital advancements are completely meaningless.
It's a sobering and entirely realistic projection. And as a final word of structural clarity for today's analysis, I want to emphasize that viewing the world through this lens isn't about surrendering to pessimism, and it certainly isn't about adopting naive optimism.
It is strictly about realism. It is about deeply understanding the scale of our existence, recognizing the absolute inevitability of difficult trade-offs, and acknowledging our profound, unbroken, and ongoing interdependence on the Earth's heavy physical materials.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.